I'll start recording then as well. I'll start recording then as well. I'll start recording then. Okay, it's almost 9:30. I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing so that our first presenter can get ready to do that.
That's good. Well, that's not where it's supposed to start. Let's back up a little bit. Escape. Right. Hi, everybody. Oh, and thanks, Eric, for all your efforts over the past year or so. Hi again, everybody. Unfortunately, Megan Marley can't be with us this morning, so Jeff and I are sharing the presentation. The Newark Holy Stones are 6 enigmatic artifacts, 5 of which are engraved with Hebrew letters. All of them were reportedly found near the ancient American Indian earthworks in the vicinity of Newark, Ohio. These 5 were found within a relatively short, 5 of them were found within a relatively short period of time, between June 1860 and August 1867. And by 1881, at the latest, archaeologists and historians had dismissed all of them as forgeries. In 1980, Robert Ulrichs, a professor of biology at Denison University, declared in a peer-reviewed scientific journal that the Holy Stones had been prematurely condemned as fraudulent and that they warranted a more in-depth study. As a direct result of his reassessment, the Holy Stones have featured prominently in a revival of pseudoscientific claims, including a 2010 documentary on the lost civilizations of North America, which was featured on the Glenn Beck Show on the Fox News channel, and on a 2013 episode of America Unearthed on the History Channel. In this paper, we review the circumstances of the discovery of each of the Holy Stones. That's going to be my job. Present the evidence that demonstrates they are forgeries, and establish the historical context that provided the motivation for the forgeries. So in late June 1860, David Wyrick, who was the Licking County surveyor and an avid antiquarian, conducted an excavation into a small depression associated with one of the small earthen enclosures at the Newark earthworks. This is his map, by the way. In the course of his excavations, he encountered a carved and polished plumb bob shaped stone that had Hebrew letters engraved on each of its 4 faces. And the local Episcopal minister translated the inscriptions. It was very easy to translate fully modern Hebrew characters as the laws of Jehovah, the word of the Lord, the Holy of Holies, and the King of the earth. Charles Whittlesey, one of the foremost archaeologists in Ohio at that time, just happened to be in Newark when Wyrick made his discovery. In a presentation he gave for the Firelands Historical Society in 1865, he recalled that while some denied the authenticity of the keystone, he had no such doubt, but he judged it was a historic artifact not related to the builders of the earthworks. So Wyrick continued his explorations in the region, and just 3 months later, on November 1st, 1860, he made another remarkable discovery at the Reservoir Stone Mound, located just over 7 miles south of Newark. This had been the largest ancient stone structure north of Mexico until much of it was hauled away in the 1830s to provide stone to stabilize the banks of the Licking County Reservoir. Now we know it as Buckeye Lake. Wyrick and a team of men began excavating in a clay layer where a wooden sarcophagus had been found in a previous excavation. Beneath where the so-called sarcophagus had been found, Wyrick uncovered a small stone box that contained an intricately carved slab of black limestone covered with archaic-looking Hebrew letters, along with a representation of a man in flowing robes. When translated, once again by the local Episcopal minister, Reverend McCarty. The inscription was found to include the entire Ten Commandments, and the robed figure was identified as Moses. This, therefore, inevitably became known as the Decalogue Stone. In May 1865, during excavations at a small mound just east of Newark, a group of antiquarians uncovered a small sculpture of a human head with 5 Hebrew letters engraved across the forehead. Houston McCulloch, a professor of economics at the Ohio State University, later observed that the inscription consisted of the Hebrew letters corresponding to the Hebrew characters J, H, N, C, L. Now, Hebrew has no vowels, so this can be sort of literally read in English as J.H. Nickel, who was one of the participants in the excavation, thus proving rather conclusively that the inscribed head was a deliberate prank. In the following months, a Mr. Cooper, who we don't know much about, conducted additional excavations into the same mound and discovered yet another holy stone. The Cooper stone is a carved mix of human faces and animal forms with, once again, 5 Hebrew letters inscribed across the forehead of one of the faces. This inscription also corresponded to John Nickel's name transliterated into Hebrew. Whittlesey noted that Nickel had been, quote, so much annoyed, unquote, that more credit was given to the statements of Wyrick than to his claim that Wyrick had planted the Decalogue Stone where it was later found, that, quote, he fabricated 2 or more specimens to show how easily people could be deceived. The Johnson stone was found in August of 1867 by N. Rowe Bradner, Jr., within a cranium that David Johnson had excavated from the Reservoir Stone Mound, where the Decalogue Stone had been found. It was a small, wedge-shaped stone inscribed with characters similar to those found on the Decalogue Stone and made from the same black limestone. Johnson shipped the cranium to Bradner, and when Bradner unpacked it, it came apart, and he found the stone, quote, in the midst of the dirt which the skull contained, unquote. Finally, in 1985, Allrutz presented a paper about the Newark Holy Stones to a conference sponsored by the Institute for the Study of Collective Behavior and Memory that was being held at Newark. It was subsequently published, Allrutz's presentation that is, in the journal Horace. As part of the paper, he described the discovery of a small stone that resembled a modern coin. Allrutz indicated that the stone was found in 1969 by an Ohio Power employee while installing a pole near the East Main Street Bridge in Newark. Allrutz reported that the marine biologist and epigrapher Barry Fell identified the object as a copy of an Iberian trading piece. Fell's account, which he published in 1980 in his book Saga America, is rather different from Allrutz's. Fell stated that the object was made from baked ceramic, not stone, and was found 90 years ago. He concluded that it was a crude and barbarously executed American copy of an ancient bronze coin of Evia, depicting the face of the Gorgon Medusa on one side and a travesty of the head of Hercules on the other side, unquote. He argued that the inscription was, quote, a formula that has been known to numismatists since the 1920s, but was totally unknown in 1880 when the Ohio object was found, unquote, and therefore it cannot possibly be a forgery. The 2 published accounts differ in important details. Is it made from stone or ceramic? Was it found in 1969 or 1880? Even if it is an authentic relic of antiquity, it has no context, and neither Allrutz nor Fell suggests it was inscribed with Hebrew letters. Nevertheless, Allrutz included a discussion of this curious object in his paper on the Newark Holy Stones, so he believed it was somehow related to and provided support for them. Fortunately, the Allrutz papers at the Johnson Hermitage Museum include detailed black and white photographs of both faces of the object, which have allowed us to consider Fell's claims in some detail. I'm turning it over to Jeff.
All right. Thank you, Brad. So, epigraphy, paleography, morphology, typography. Looking at the inscriptions on the Newark holy stones, you can end up calling on all of these disciplines and more. The inscriptions and the Hebrew texts they represent are the real claim to significance for these objects. Their forms are unusual and atypical for the Middle Woodland contexts out of which they came, but it's the Hebrew letters and the words which have kept the holy stones in public debate for now over a century and a half. The problem with the Hebrew lettering on these objects in question is that they don't hold up under the lens of common sense. The idea that whether in 1860 or today, we're looking at ancient Hebrew, somehow incorporated into the material culture of 2,000 years ago in Ohio, is not sustainable on the merits. As was noted by most of the first observers in the summer of 1860, the 4 phrases on the keystone are carved in stone, but the 29 letters are shaped exactly like typeface Hebrew. The serifs and the strokes of each individual letter are not only more contemporary than any ancient form of the Hebrew alphabet, they seem to be an attempt to precisely replicate how those letters would look in a print version of the Hebrew scriptures. That puts the inscription somewhere this side of Gutenberg, later than 1450 at any rate. But common sense comes in pretty quickly as well. If you look at the original object, not the slightly tidied up engraving so often shown in reference to the keystone, you only need a passing knowledge of Hebrew to notice something odd. It's a language that's written from right to left. So the letters are arranged, yet each phrase is more or less jammed over to the right. It's impossible to notice this and not realize that the phrases are carved from left to right, with some improvement between when the person who created it carved the wider, flatter sides and the 2 narrower edges in spacing out the phrase to be carved. In other words, they got a little bit better, but still the spacing shows they were being carved left to right, even though the Hebrew goes right to left. In fact, many advocates of the antiquity of the Decalogue Stone are fairly quick to join Charles Whittlesey and other early skeptics in throwing the keystone back into the dirt from whence it came. The early consensus is rarely challenged even today. The keystone alphabet is too modern to be ancient. The object has overtones of Masonic influence and was found fairly near the surface. So if it's an actual artifact versus a planted fabrication, it's a lost piece of regalia from early American Freemasonry. Keep that in mind. So David Wyrick digs next a few miles south of Newark into the subsurface elements of a formerly 40-foot tall stone mound, deeper into a log tomb and the clay below it. On November 1st, 1860, a week before a certain portentous national election for president, he uncovers a stone box, and within an object which has since been known as the Decalogue Stone. It has a bas-relief figure and letters spelling out the 10 Commandments. This Decalogue inscription, winding around the frame of the figure and across the other sides of the stone, was not a form of Hebrew lettering that looked immediately familiar. In fact, the find and the form of the letters neatly answered the 3 concerns which swept aside the keystone. It was out of what was at least once a deeply buried location, with a Hebrew alphabet that was ancient in appearance, and it looked like nothing anyone had seen in a Masonic lodge or anywhere else. Aha! Now we have a Hebrew inscription that has to be considered in the context of ancient America, before Columbus, perhaps nearer to the time of Moses. Except the Decalogue Stone and its inscription has some of the same problems the keystone has. It's a matter of no little interest that if the keystone is easily dismissed, but the Decalogue less so, then why is it that, aside from the facts that one man found both, and just 4 months apart from each discovery, they also both share neatly the exact same primary dimensions? Different types of stone result in two different colors, and the general outline of each is somewhat different, but the breadth and thickness of the two are identical, and the length of the keystone is identical to the length of the Decalogue Stone from the top to the opening at its base, with another inch of handle extending below. Holding up the two next to each other, they certainly have the appearance and dimensions of two objects from the same workshop, not items vastly distant in time and origins. Having noted that interesting coincidence, to understand why the Decalogue version of Hebrew doesn't hold up as ancient any more than the Keystones did, again, you don't need to know much Hebrew. Consider English typography and the calligraphy of some 2 centuries ago. You have doubtless seen a copy of the 1789 U.S. Bill of Rights, and perhaps you've wondered a bit at the inscription at its head, Congress of the United States. Old English documents from the Revolutionary era back through John Milton and before used a convention of the long S, which today looks to us like an F. Our usual S was then more of a terminal form, the way you wrote the letter at the end of a word. In that bookhand, a scribe might write "success" for success. It looks like a typo to us, a mistaken spelling of loft instead of lost. But in the late 1700s, most anyone who is literate would have seen the usage for what it was, the long S and terminal S used in their appropriate places. Hebrew has terminal forms of some letters as well. To simplify our discussion of the 21 letters of the Decalogue alphabet that are used in the 253-letter inscription, there are a number of places where the oddly shaped square Hebrew of the Decalogue letter forms have errors, the wrong letter for the Hebrew word which we can deduce, as they did in 1860 from the Exodus text. And there are a majority of these erroneous letters that are either at the end of words, where a terminal form in typeface Hebrew looks like another standard form, such as terminal kaf and a standard daleth, being the chief example, or simply letters that look similar, especially by lamp or candlelight, like a vav or daleth. The problem with saying that these are simply scribal errors is that the errors fall consistently into a pattern. Letters not similar between the supposedly ancient Decalogue alphabet and a more modern typeface Hebrew are switched, and the errors become not mistakes of expression, but are clearly transpositions. In fact, even J. Houston McCullough, in his 1992 transcription, which he wrote to make the case for the antiquity and authenticity of the Decalogue Stone, notes in one case the error could only have been made when the text was written in standard Hebrew letters, where Vav and Daleth look very much alike, and not in the Ohio Decalogue alphabet, where these letters cannot be confused. McCullough had already noticed the pattern with word endings of the transposed terminal forms, saying, quote, "A few other discrepancies point instead to someone's having slavishly copied a standard Hebrew text without understanding all the words," close quote. Dismissing the errors in orthography as something similar to terminal forms in the Dead Sea Scrolls, he moves on to propose that some of the errors could point to roots in ancient Hebrew grammar. However, the transpositions on the Decalogue Stone aren't so easily dismissed. First, because in the Paleo Hebrew and Square Hebrew and Aramaic of the Dead Sea Scrolls, there are not the same sorts of terminal forms, not even close. And as for ancient Hebrew grammar, we didn't have enough Hebrew knowledge between us to rule that out. But who could verify for us that in 3,000 years of Hebrew usage, the error pattern wasn't just a Semitic outlier? This is why we wrote to Frank Moore Cross, Hancock Professor of Hebrew at Harvard University, and in 1991, the leading American scholar of Hebrew in general and the Dead Sea Scrolls in particular. And we laid out our case to him about the epigraphy and haplography of the errors on the Decalogue Stone, asking specifically if there was any possibility that there was any other explanation than a modern fraud. We got a reply from him, which in detail said to us that our understanding was certainly correct. He picked through the inscription and noted at least 3 other places where the only reason the erroneous letter in Decalogue terms would have been carved was if the carver was starting with a modern Hebrew printed page. At this point, our study of the Hebrew holy stones began to shift. If the keystone is generally conceded to be modern in manufacture, and if the physical parallels between the 2 artifacts suggest a similar origin for the Decalogue stone, which our analysis of the inscription confirms is a modern forgery, then our question is no longer about if the holy stones are a hoax, but we turn to the question of why. Well, we follow the early Ohio archaeologist Matthew Canfield Reed, who wrote in 1892, "Such forgeries will always in some way represent the ideas of the time of the forgery." The holy stones, if genuine, would provide a definitive answer to the most consequential question in 19th century American science, religion, and politics. The question of which of the so-called human races counted as truly human. And more immediately, was it morally defensible to enslave African blacks? Supporters of monogenesis, the biblically based doctrine that all humans were sons and daughters of Adam and Eve, were opposed to slavery. Supporters of polygenesis argued that the varied human races were actually separate species, and therefore it was acceptable to enslave African blacks or to remove by any means necessary Native Americans from their homelands. Josiah Knott, an Alabama physician, was one of the principal proponents of polygenesis. He argued that the biblical account was incorrect in a single or mono origin for humanity, and that science showed clearly multiple creations of different races on different continents with differing capacity for self-governance and even differing levels of humanity. The Newark Holy Stones, if authentic, would prove not wrong. American Indians, and by extension, America's enslaved African blacks, must then be acknowledged to be children of Adam and Eve. If this was indeed the intended purpose of the Holy Stones, then the fact that the Keystone and Decalogue Stone appeared during the final days of the presidential campaign of 1860 was no coincidence. The interwoven debates over monogenesis, polygenesis, and the Holy Stones were overtaken by historical events. The American Civil War ended slavery in America, and Charles Darwin's On the Origin of Species, published in 1859, rendered the debate between polygenesis and monogenesis largely irrelevant. As a result, the Holy Stones became not only unhelpful in fulfilling the purpose for which they had been created, they had become potentially dangerous to the perpetrators if the fraud were to be exposed. So they lapsed into obscurity, at least until Bob Ulritz once more brought them into the limelight. And so we add this epilogue with the coin of Evia. After a hiatus of more than a century, another holy stone turns up in Newark. Ulritz believed it somehow supported his ideas about the original holy stones, and Barry Fell agreed. We do not think this enigmatic object is in fact relevant to the Holy Stone story, and offer the following refutation of Fell's analysis of the object because his 1980 claims have never been addressed. The Newark artifact has the image of a grotesque face and text on one side and an image of an old man on the other. Fell claimed that the old man is a depiction of Hercules, but this assertion is unfounded, as none of Hercules' standard attributes, the club, lion skin, bow, sword, defined musculature, and a beard, are present. Representations of Hercules as an older man exist, but he is never depicted with the number of wrinkles seen in the Newark artifact because he is said to have died a relatively young man. Therefore, there is no basis on which to identify the old man image on the Newark object as Hercules. Fell claims that the other image on the artifact is the Gorgon Medusa, and it is similarly completely unfounded. The face has none of the standard attributes of Medusa that would allow it to be identified as her or even as a generic Gorgon. Gorgons generally are shown with snakes' hair, thick eyebrows, wild eyes, usually with pupils, a pig-like or bulbous nose, sharp teeth, and a tongue sticking out. There's nothing about the image on the Newark artifact that indicates it was intended to depict either Medusa or another Gorgon. It's likely that Fell only identified the faces on the Newark artifact as Hercules and Medusa to provide support for his otherwise unfounded claim that the object was part of the Odysseus coin type. Fell claimed that the object was a coin created not by ancient Hebrews, but by Celtiberian people living in Ohio during the late 4th or early 3rd century BCE. He claimed it was therefore the oldest known American coin. He identified the inscription located to the right of a supposed Gorgon's head as retrograde Iberian Greek, stating Odysseus Ebiom or Odakis Ebiom in Latin. He further asserted that Odysseus is the Iberian form of the ancient Greek word for currency, and Evium is an alternative spelling for the Celtic city Evia, later renamed by the Romans as Salacia, and now the modern town of Alcácer do Sal, Portugal. The makers of this object, according to Fell, must have been from Evia and reproduced this known coin type when they ran out of their original currency supplies while in North America. All of these claims are entirely wrong and reveal a lack of knowledge about ancient Mediterranean material culture, language, iconography, geography, and history. Every ancient Mediterranean society used metal currency, either ingots or coinage made of iron or precious metals. Prior to currency, these societies used a barter system. Thus, when they switched to currency, the coinage had to have an intrinsic value that would be worth trading. This concept is why the gold standard was used widely in modern times during the 19th and 20th centuries. Fell, therefore, was wrong in his claims that this object was a coin, let alone the oldest known American coin, as the medium is entirely wrong. Additionally, Fell's claim that the Newark artifact is a copy of a documented type of coin minted in Evia and the dating to the 3rd and 2nd century BCE is not credible, because the images and text on the Newark artifact do not match what are found on such coins. Ancient coins in the Mediterranean were normally struck between dies, and where there could be some slight difference between coins, the overall imagery and text remained the same. There are indeed Odysseus coin types from the Celtic city, later known as Salacia. However, the Newark artifact looks nothing like them. Fell's translation of the text on the Newark artifact also is fatally flawed. The word Odysseus is not the Iberian form of the Greek word for currency. Numisma is the correct ancient Greek word for it. The closest Greek word is hodon, from the verb hodeo, which means to export or sell. No conjugation of the word could result in it being spelled similarly to Odysseus. Furthermore, the word on the actual coin type is written in Latin. Thus, Fell's claim that Odysseus is the Iberian Greek version of the word, while Odakis is the Latin, is not credible. All of Fell's claims regarding the Newark artifact are easily disproved. There is no evidence that this object is a coin, that the language is retrograde Iberian Greek, that the faces depicted on it depict Hercules or Medusa, that the text states currency of Evia, or that the artifact's makers knew anything about Paleo-Hispanic or ancient Mediterranean history, geography, or culture. A more likely interpretation of the object is that it was made in the late 19th or early 20th centuries by someone living in the Newark area as an art project or as a poor quality fake. Given what is known about the context of its discovery, little else can or need be said. That concludes our presentation.
All right, thank you, Eric. So now for something completely different from what we just heard. I just wanted to say a few things about some of the work we did this past summer at the Heckelman site. And in particular, one feature that is turns out to be rather unique and something that at least I've not encountered before in Northern Ohio. And there we go. So the site is the Heckelman site, located in southern Erie County in the upper Huron River Valley. There's a bit of close-up of the area. You can see in red is the approximate location of the site itself. It sits on this bluff top overlooking the floodplain of the Huron River, just a few miles west of the little town of Milan, birthplace of Thomas Edison. And we've done a number of years of excavation, about 9 total seasons at this site. And we know a lot about, or learning a lot more about the general site itself in terms of the large area. And a lot of that has to do with a lot of geophysical work done for us by Jared Burks beginning in 2008. This is the kind of the latest mag map we have of just about definitely almost the entire area of the Heckelman site itself and some areas to the north. And basically what it's telling us is a number of things, again, about the site at large. In the area along the bluff line on the southern part of the field there, outlined in yellow, there's at least 100 or more possible magnetic anomalies that are likely Native American pre-contact pit features of one kind or another, including earth ovens, fire crack rock concentrations, things like that. Also, we can see in the mag data that this area outlined in yellow is highly magnetic. The soil is very magnetic. You could even see the plow scars there pretty distinctly. So in all, it looks like this site is something like 2 hectares in size, which is pretty large for a Northern Ohio site. About 5 acres or so. And probably, hopefully, the one thing that really stands out in this to your eye, on the right, the lower right there, is a number of anomalies that represent earthworks or ditches related to former embankments and enclosures. And here's a close-up, and this is work that Jared did in 2008 for us. In the center there, those 2 long parallel anomalies are ditch features. Actually, one of those was discovered before we got to the site back in probably 1968, 70 by Dr. Orrin Shane at Kent State University. Did some work at the site over 4 summers and discovered at least one of these ditch features. But since his work, which ended about 1974, nothing really has been done out there in any large scale. But a lot of our work is involved examining the parallel ditches you see here, and also this very interesting, surprising oval enclosure, ditched enclosure, which again is something I've seen similar things show up in Jared's work in Southern Ohio, but basically nothing like this in Northern Ohio. Our excavations have told us that this is likely an early woodland feature based on material or contents of the ditch itself and also radiocarbon dates. And then the 2 parallel ditches has material from the middle woodland right up to the late pre-contact period. A lot of what's in the fill of this eastern ditch happens to be Hopewell or Hopewellian artifacts, essentially almost filling the ditch itself. And then here I'm just putting these earthworks on the topographic map of the site, and you can see this eastern part of the site is essentially a promontory enclosed by these two parallel ditches. This pattern is very common across northern Ohio. These are these so-called hilltop enclosures, a number of sites that exist from minimally the Pennsylvania line west almost to Toledo on some of the major river valleys. And then also there's a couple small mounds on the property that have been identified that still exist. And there may have been one larger mound out in the field here just west of the parallel ditches, based on family lore and stories about what was done in the past. And this is just to show you the location of our different excavation areas over this time. Now, this work initially was started out with the University of Toledo and the late Dr. David Stuthers, and also Firelands Archaeology, the nonprofit group that we work with very closely in north central Ohio. And then over on the right is a block area, excavation area, where most of our museum excavations focused in the eastern part of the site. And then we returned to the site in 2017. Over here on the west, we have for 3 seasons, we did excavation in this area. Now I'll just touch on that very briefly. We have at least 68 radiocarbon dates now from our work at this site, and they basically represent occupations from the early woodland, middle woodland with a Hopewellian component included, the late woodland period, and then the late pre-contact period, ending up around 1400 with the establishment of what we know now probably 2 village sites. But today, the feature I want to talk about is really relates to this late woodland occupation, which a lot of it centers out around 600 AD. If you see in the lines of radiocarbon dates here, this late woodland occupation pretty much follows on the heels of the middle woodland. There's not a really distinct break in time between these. We just have some of the typical Hopewell artifacts dropping out of the assemblages. This is just a view of the excavation plan of this large block area in the upper kind of northeast corner of the site. Again, this is the area that museum, we spent most of our work over the past 8 or 9 seasons. And it's just this myriad of pit features, post mold lines, all sorts of things out there, hundreds of, probably thousands of post molds, dozens and dozens of features. Which some things are recognizable. I think in this you can see these distinct lines of post molds. These represent stockade lines, concentric stockade lines related to the late pre-contact period village occupation. Some over here as well. And then we have, again, features from the early woodland, middle, and late woodland as well. And basically everything right on top of everything else. For some reason, this little eastern end of the site itself was heavily occupied again and again and again over time, which gives us a lot to look at and can be quite confusing trying to sort this out. But I think we got a pretty good handle on it. But specifically what I want to talk about today is this work we did in 2013, and it's represented by these squares. These are excavation squares, all from the 2013 work. And this is a close-up of what we call Structure 5, and this is the feature I'm interested in today. In 2013, among the other things we recorded, we found what looked like a distinct arc of post molds, rather large post molds, 20 or 15 to a little over 20, 21 centimeters in diameter, extending down 30, 40 centimeters below the plow zone. So really stout, pretty large posts that seem to form this pattern you see here. And then, of course, we went away. We went to another site and came back in 2017 and worked on areas in the western part of the site. But we did decide to return in 2021 to really test out this kind of this preliminary interpretation I had that this might be some type of structure, a circular structure, maybe a post structure, something like that. In 2013, we did, as you see, excavate a number of large post molds. There's one here shown on the right. Again, about 20 centimeters in diameter. Some of them had pottery in them. Unfortunately, none of them had a lot of material to actually get radiocarbon dates with, so we don't have any dates from post molds from that season. But in this particular post mold, we did find fragments of a rim sherd with very distinct vertical chord marking, very rather fine cordage used, and very closely spaced. And this is This type of ceramic is very typical of the late woodland occupation in north central Ohio, what's called Green Creek phase. It has similarities to like Newtown ceramics or Newtown cord mark to some degree, somewhat angular shoulders on some vessels, that type of thing. But it fits right in that basic time frame. But it's really a good diagnostic, and it was in 2013 because it came out of this post that was part of this arc of posts. So at that point, we kind of realized we may be having some type of late woodland feature here to deal with. Now, the Green Creek phase occupation is known from other features at the site. We excavated over several different seasons, off and on. On the upper left is the remains of a Green Creek cord mark pottery vessel that probably was essentially whole and in a pit and probably truncated by plowing and crushed down. On the lower right, you can see a reconstruction of most of the body of the vessel. This is very thin, very well-made pottery, amazingly thin for a vessel this size. And then this is a close-up of one of the rim sherds that would have been part of that vessel with the very typical fine, closely spaced cord marking with a very a good pace, finely grit tempered that you see here. This is in orange features here. We're seeing features that have late woodland radiocarbon dates or Green Creek pottery, or both, down in this area here, among all the other features of different time frames. As it turns out, these pits down here and over down here turned out to be, I believe, within a structure I call Structure 2, which was a series of post molds that were picked out of the morass of post molds in this area by their size and depth. And here's a close-up of Structure 2. This was pretty much recognized in about 2011, 2012. And it's kind of this rectanguloid structure, kind of rounded corners. It's 9 meters in diameter, so it's a really large structure, again, for our region. And you can see the location of some of the radiocarbon dates that were produced from dating some of these features and some of the pottery that came out of these different locations. Just about all this stuff is what we call Green Creek phase wear. And you can see the dates range from, the 500s definitely into the 600s or the 7th century AD. And I think for the structure, at least, some occupation during the 600s or so seems likely. I also interpreted this as a communal dwelling. There's kind of mirroring of pit clusters, including cooking pits and storage pits on one side, and then another group down here. So it may represent the occupation. It may be 2 families or so at the site, but definitely a domestic construction. And then there was a set of features that several of which by recent dating turned out to be late woodland in age. I initially took these all to be middle woodland, Hopewellian related features, and some still may be because we only dated a couple, as you can see the dates listed there. I've been calling these lithic cache pits because they have not much in them except lots of bifacial thinning flakes. In some cases, 100 to 200 found in these pits, along with a little bit of fire-cracked rock. Not much else, not even much charcoal or something like that for dating. But it's exceptional to have that many, that large quantity of flakes, and probably now about a half a dozen pits from the site. And again, a couple of them do have late woodland dates. And in a couple of the pits, we also found these fragments of bifaces. I think most of these are, manufacturing failures that were basically deposited in these pits along with maybe just about all the flakes that were removed from these bifaces. So I think of it kind of as a cache, a process of making these triangular bifaces and then caching the residue, the remains of them. And that type of behavior kind of struck me as interesting. It could have just be, simple refuse disposal, but the fact that many of the other pits of this age, of late woodland age, and other previous occupations at the site have very little lithics in them, very few flakes, not much debitage at all. This is exceptional, the numbers of material in here. And I kind of took this to represent possibly something related to making objects, these triangular bifaces, as something that had some ritual significance or importance, special type of objects, and maybe the process of creating them had some kind of importance to the people making these beyond just making utilitarian items. And then the gathering up of the remains of these materials and even broken bifaces that couldn't be used were deposited in these pits, maybe as a way to dispose or cache these into the ground, a little more than just disposing of refuse, as I said. Botanical remains from the late woodland pits, rather meager. There was some fair amount of chenopod, probably domesticated chenopod, and a little bit of bottle gourd. And also this specimen, and shown in this picture on the left. This was identified by Karen Leone a number of years ago, who did all our botanical analysis. Based on the form of this carbonized piece on the left there, she thinks it may represent a piece of a tobacco stem, a tobacco plant stem, which she said she's never really seen much at all in this region preserved like that. And here in this picture, she compares it to a modern stalk. And it seems to have kind of the same morphology as the modern form of tobacco stems, which if that's the case, and I think it is, it represents perhaps bringing tobacco plants, maybe cultivating them on site, but at least bringing perhaps dried tobacco with stems attached to the site for some kind of processing and used in pipe smoking and related uses. Okay, back to our structure 5. Hopefully you can make it out on the screen, but I do have some of the squares identified again on the right part of the excavation area in green. And those are the excavation units that we undertook and excavated this past summer. So these here, here, and down here. The other area to the west is the area we excavated in 2013. And in red, I have marked the post molds that were found and recorded in 2013. So again, we returned to the site in 2021, and one of my major research questions was to see, is this really a structure? Does this arc continue? Is it a circle or some kind of enclosed structure? In fact, I think we kind of showed it is. In blue here are large post molds of the same type found in 2013 that extend to the northeast and to the southeast on both ends. Due to time constraints, we really didn't have time we couldn't dig much more of the structure. We did find what I think is a central post, fairly large post. And based on that and the apparent radius between this and what seems to be a wall line over here, we kind of projected just about a perfect circle over the top of this. And most of these posts fall pretty close in line with that. We also used the distance from the sidewall to the center post, projected that to the east, and took a gamble, and we put an excavation unit over here, and we happened to find, as it turns out, another large post right there, which, you know, I think is likely to be a post from the other side of the circle, if circles can have sides, I guess, or the eastern perimeter you see there. So I think what we had here essentially is a post circle, a post wall or enclosure of some type. So structure 5, based on that assessment, is about 13.5 meters in diameter. So it's fairly large, larger than our structure 2 late woodland structure I mentioned a minute ago. A floor area of about 143 square meters. The mean diameter of these perimeter posts, the circle post here, is about 23.9 centimeters with a standard deviation of about 6 centimeters. And the mean post depth is about almost 55 centimeters below the plow zone at the point of definition, with a standard deviation of about 10 centimeters. So again, large posts forming what looks like a coherent shape or wall line there. Now, this is the first time we found post circles, and some of you may remember about 3 years ago, I gave a talk at the fall meeting, I believe, on a large post circle that we recorded in 2017 and 2018, which I now call structure 6. It's maybe 3 times, you know, the size, or at least twice to 3 times the size of the structure 5 that I just showed you. It's about 376 square meters in the interior. The posts are similar to structure 5. These are about 19 centimeters or so. And the depths are a little bit, pretty close, about 26 centimeters below plow zone. I was able to date charcoal from one of these posts in this line here which produced a date of 8085 to 160, which would fall in our middle woodland occupation. And I think best guess right now, this is probably a middle woodland construction. I want to point out that interior to this, there's a number of small to large post molds, which don't seem to form any particular structural forms that I can see. We did find the remains of a large central pit or post pit, which had the remains or post molds of what were two large, very deeply buried, probably central posts, maybe one used sequentially, which went down to about a meter or so below surface, so rather deeply set. This feature here is a keyhole structure. This is a pit house, which happens to date to the late pre-contact village occupation. As it turns out, there's another village occupation out here on the western part of the site, over here. And by the way, I did put a little bit of Jared's map in here showing this circular anomaly. He was able to detect this feature before we did any excavation. Hope you can make out the circular anomaly there. And again, that's what we were testing in this area. But I don't think this is the same, as I'll mention in a minute. I don't think this is the same type of structure. This reminds me more of a possibly just a ceremonial post enclosure, which are found in Adena sites, early woodland sites, and in middle woodland sites in southern Ohio, in the middle Ohio Valley. So we have back to structure 5 here. This is kind of a simplified map showing you just some of the features related to the late woodland occupation. Again, we have the perimeter posts, we have the central post, and then a number of features, including what I think might be structural posts. These are 4 posts that somewhat arc around the central area. These were large, rather deep posts. Here, they may represent some type of interior support, which if that's the case, it may be that this structure actually had a roof or some kind of superstructure to it at one time. Which makes it rather different, I think, than the last post circle I've described. And then a number of other types of features. In green are a couple of these, again, what I'm calling lithic cache pits here, and one right there, which contained, 100 or more bifacial thinning flakes as well. And I'll show you what came out of this one in a second. These black ovals represent another type of feature, which I don't remember seeing or really recorded much at all in other parts of this site. I'm calling them charcoal deposits because basically that's what they are. They're thin layers or lenses of charcoal and soil, have very little in them in the way of artifacts or anything diagnostic. But they're unusual, and I've not seen those in other areas of the site. And there's some up here near the perimeter area, one more in the interior, and one kind of just beyond it here. And also we found over in this unit on the east, we found what I think is a storage pit, a rather large pit, which contains some material, a few sherds of Green Creek cord mark wear, but not a lot of material, typical of a lot of the storage pits that we do find at this site. Just to mention about a couple of these feature types in the interior of the structure. This is one of the charcoal deposits. This is feature 2121. This is probably the best preserved of these. It has a little bit of depth to it. Located the one up here in the map on the upper left. Again, didn't contain much at all, but I was get a decent sized piece of charcoal to date. And as luck would have it, it produced the middle woodland date, 250 to 411 AD. I was expecting maybe a late woodland date. Not sure how accurate that is. It could be the case that this is a heretofore undiscovered or recognized middle woodland feature, but I'm not so sure of that. But in any case, these seem to be somewhat associated with structure 5. Here's feature 2119. This is one of the lithic cache pits, which actually had some other interesting objects in it. Here's a view of a partial section of this, and here what you can see is a slate disc, a flaked or chipped slate disc. Here's a close-up of it here. I was very surprised to find this because we've not found this type of artifact anywhere else at the Heckelman site, even in the landowners' collections. But these are found not uncommonly on late woodland sites in northern Ohio, some of the western basin sites in northwest Ohio as well, and also on sites, late woodland sites in the rest of Ohio, down towards the central Ohio Valley, Newtown sites and related type sites, even in the Muskingum Valley, I believe, as well. So it's kind of a good diagnostic for the late woodland era in Ohio, I think. So it was interesting to find that. Then there was another object down here above the signboard, which was, again, something like unlike anything we found before. And that's here on the right. This is, I originally took this to be a hematite concretion. It's definitely got iron in it. And what we really have is a chunk or a nodule of cemented sand, soil, and little pieces of gravel cemented by iron that's apparently precipitated out of some type of iron-bearing stone or object, maybe a piece of hematite, which wasn't present in the pit. But it seems to be rather carefully placed in the pit itself, below the area of the slate disc and just below a large piece of siltstone rock, unmodified siltstone. So I don't know what that represents. The disc in this may be, again, something placed deliberately in the pit, maybe as an offering or something like that. It doesn't seem to have any utilitarian use in this case. But also this pit did contain a lot of this debitage as well, including this biface here. Another example, I think, of a failure, a broken biface right here. And then this is just a field, shot of a field drawing of the feature 2127, which is the, I believe, a storage pit located over here, and a piece of, looks like Green Creek core marker that came out of it. And then here's some of the radiocarbon dates for the late Woodland occupation. Again, they range again from 600 to maybe 1000 AD. I really think probably the most reliable dates are the 600 to 800 AD time slot here. And here again, you know, this is the date for the one post mold we're able to date from the circle, feature 2102. And then, of course, the pit I just showed you with the slate disc, more on the 600 to closer to 700 AD. And kind of just to finish up to say, you know, from my search of the literature, there's not a lot of really good data on late woodland structures. There's a few really good examples. This is a figure from Jared Burke's dissertation, where he looked at late middle woodland to late woodland structures. Probably some of the ones that might be analogous to what we have in structure 5 are these circular structure like at the Deco site. These have comparable diameters, 12 meters, 9 meters at the Zencor site, and then 14 meters of the Licklider site. And I think this might be kind of the most analogous to what we have at Heckelman. And just this has a similar size. It has interior pits, charcoal deposits, and probably what are storage pits on the inside. It's not been well dated, but based on the ceramics, it appears to date to the Newtown occupation in near Dayton, Ohio. So that's my brief description of the structure 5 and our work at Heckelman this past summer. Something unusual, something we're going to be doing a little bit more work and analysis with. Thank you.
Thanks, Brian. That was really interesting. I couldn't help but think similarities to early woodland post structures as well, but you know, obviously it's a lot earlier in time, but I mean, it was just on my mind. Anyway, so we'll hold questions for Brian and for Brad and Jeff. Again, like I said, afterwards, if people do have questions. We're going to move on to our next presenter, which is Kevin Nolan, Christine Thompson, Rebecca Barzilay, and Moyad Yaqub. I hope I pronounced those names right. I'm guessing they're students.
And Emily Hayes.
Oh, and Emily Hayes.
Cut that off the original one. But.
Oh, sorry. I can go in and edit that. And Emily Hayes. And the title of their presentation is Unearthing a Half Century of Archaeological Research in Indiana, Digitizing the Report of Investigations and Archaeological Report Series and Associated Diagnostic Artifacts. So without further ado, I turn it over to Kevin and company.
Oh, there we go. You guys see that?
Yes.
All right. Okay. So we're going to talk about our CLIR grant to document and make available some research projects that have been done out of the Ball State Anthropology Department and Archaeology Lab. I do want to start by pointing out that Chris should have been the lead author on this, and she did so much of the work to get this together that I didn't even realize that she put my name first until I named this file Thompson et al. And so Chris has done the majority of the heavy lifting for this and keeping it going through all of the numerous and varied obstacles that we've had to overcome to keep this project moving. So this is just want to explicitly acknowledge that before I get started. So we're going to cover project overview, discuss a couple of examples that we used in our application to justify our proposal of hidden collections at Ball State here. Then we'll talk about the team and the workflow that we've planned and developed and then implemented, the challenges that we've gone through, and then talk about successes, and if there's time, a demonstration of some of the features and data that's available, and then what our next steps are. So the project overview, the goals were to digitize over 50 years of archaeological research in anthropology and archaeology at Ball State, starting from the 1960s with the work of Ben Swartz up through today. And a lot of these are significant and foundational studies in Indiana archaeology relevant to Midwest archaeology, but they've been of limited distribution. And so making them available to scholars, but also in some form to the general public with redacted reports available. We're going to be using the digital archaeological record, creating projects and resources up there available to everyone to use. We are digitizing and running optical character recognition, OCR, on all of our archaeological report series documents and reports of investigation. Also, some notes and maps will be digitized, and we're going to get models of 4,000 diagnostic artifacts from these reports for both 3D models and high resolution color photographs of at least two sides of the artifacts. The funding comes from the Council on Library and Information Resources, or CLIR, CLEAR, the Digitizing Hidden Collections program, and then we also successfully got an emergency relief fund for complications introduced to projects by COVID. So it's a total of $257,000 with a 2-year timeline. So we're going from our hard, tangible records, printed reports and notes in filing cabinets and point type collections and everything to digital records on Tdar, annotated with detailed metadata, and also Sketchfab we are using to distribute as another mechanism to distribute the 3D models. The 3D model files will also be uploaded into Tdar, but the Sketchfab, we have a Sketchfab collection for these models that they're available to view and download already on there. And so that link will take you there.
Hey, Kevin.
Yes.
Can you go back to the slide with the cabinet?
Yep.
So I just want to point out to everybody, the cabinet in the top right-hand corner with all the drawers that, I don't know, came from a library or something, was filled with points. So thousands of points. And I'm going to be talking about that later. So that cabinet is now empty, but it's very near and dear to my part of to my heart right now. So
yeah, that was one of the organizational challenges, is tying all of those back to the report, which was fun. But yes, thank you. Okay, so you can go and look at some of these scans that are already up from Sketchfab BSU_AAL CLIR collection. And so we have 2 different series of reports that have been published out of this end of the of the hallway, the Archaeological Report series, which was started in 1966 by Dr. Ben Swartz, that was largely publicizing and distributing the results of his field surveys and field schools. Many of the reports have sections that are authored or co-authored by students contributing primary scholarship, but they were of very limited distribution, and a lot of them, some of them we don't even have copies of, and so we're having to recreate them from records that we have, and many people have never heard of any of them. The Reports of Investigation series, it started when Dr. Ron Hicks created the Archaeological Resource Management Services in 1978. The ARMS lab eventually became, in 2009, AAL, Applied Anthropology Laboratories. And AAL is continuing the ROI series as the distribution mechanism for our major research projects. So pretty much all of our grants that we do, and sometimes major contract projects, we have an ROI associated with that. So there are 18 archaeological reports and over 110 ROIs that we are managing the data for right now. So just some examples of the types of records that we are dealing with from these projects and some of the products. This is I don't know if you guys can see my cursor or not, but the one in the middle there is a 3D scan of a projectile point from one of our ROIs, and then examples of some of the 2D images that we're producing. So some of the example hidden collections that we have, the Newcastle site is a complex of pre-contact mounds and earthworks. It's one of the most significant Adena Hopewell sites in Indiana. It's listed on the National Register of Historic Places. It has been the subject of 8 archaeological reports and 2 ROIs, and other ROIs have referenced it and built on it. And it has a broader regional context as to the diversity of things that were happening during the Woodland period with ceremonial enclosures and exchange networks. And so a lot of this data is buried in, the primary data is buried in the archaeological reports series that are individual chapters scattered throughout a lot of them. Which actually, from our perspective, makes them harder to deal with because the ARs are not single projects that are bundled together. They're a mix of a bunch of different things, so it makes it more difficult to convey what's in them. But anyway, the large volume of data that we have here, some of them, including this hand-drawn topographic map, only exist in physical form and have not really been widely available to the public or to researchers. Then another hidden collection is the Paleo-Indian and Early Archaic in the Upper Wabash Valley survey that was done in 1986. And there were 175 Paleo-Indian points and 171 Early Archaic points that were documented, a lot of them in private collections. And this large sample of especially the Paleo-Indian points was missing entirely from the Paleo-Indian database. At least when we put the proposal in. I'm not sure, I haven't checked back to see if that's changed or not. But it was a substantial body of information on the distribution of Paleo-Indian and Early Archaic activity that was largely unknown outside of small parts of Indiana. Another one, and this one has connections to the broader Great Lakes region with the Albee phase and Albee cord marked ceramics being lots of related things in the Great Lakes region. At the Moral Sheet site, our ROI 38, and there were several other ROIs that deal with the Albee phase and talk about the nature of this ceramic type that was defined very early on in Indiana archaeology used very loosely, and there's some very good historical overviews and analysis of that type and of the distribution of these of similar types of sherds and the relationships that existed in the late Woodland period in the Great Lakes region. And again, these are more recent generally, so some of this is more widely known in Indiana, but outside of Indiana, these reports have limited distribution. And so this contribution to understanding these broader interaction networks in the Great Lakes region are going to be made available. And another one, the African American and Quaker farmers in East Central Indiana, it is a study of 3 free Black communities that were in Randolph County in the 19th century and adjacent parts of Ohio. And it was mixed communities of predominantly free Blacks and Quakers. And this doesn't get a lot of information and attention generally, and knowing about these early free Black settlements in Indiana and Ohio is not very widespread. And there was a large survey done, but then they also looked through archives and did oral history interviews with living descendants of some of these communities. So providing a voice today for those marginalized communities. And so bringing these artifacts and this history out will increase the promulgation of African American history in Indiana. Another strange thing about this that our project will remedy is in the report, there were no historic artifacts that were actually photographed. There were pre-contact artifacts that were illustrated, even though the primary focus of the project was the historic period occupations. None of those artifacts are available in the currently available resources online about this project. So with our Tdar collections, we will rectify that. All right, I will turn it over to Chris now.
Yeah. And one thing I wanted to mention, I don't think Kevin mentioned, we actually applied for this grant 3 times before we were awarded it. And it was basically the same project. And each time we took the reviewer comments and refined things to finally be awarded the grant. So the team we have is large. So Kevin and I are the principal investigators. The other archaeologists and staff here at the AAL, we all do things like supervise the graduate assistants and the lab techs, quality control. We make sure that the processes are standard and well written and documented properly, and of course issue resolution. So that's kind of our roles as the archaeologists and the staff. We have 2 academic year graduate assistants, so we're on our 2nd year, and they have been invaluable. We've had really 2 really good GAs. They analyze the ARs and the ROIs. They populate an access database that serves as a style guide or clearinghouse for the data that is checked, and issue resolution takes place there, and then they also populate Tdar. Then we have a whole cadre of student lab technicians. So we've had 10 different students work on this, and they do some access database population. They prepare the artifacts. They do all the 3D scanning and processing, the report digitization, artifact photography. Oh, thank you, Kevin. And then interns, we didn't, I think we knew we might have interns, but we thought they would do the same thing as the student lab technicians. The interns have been invaluable because they have been doing all the things that had to be done to get things ready to scan and photograph. And I'll talk about that a little bit more, but they have been organizing artifacts. We had an intern that emptied that whole point cabinet that I pointed out and organized that. They have returned things to curation, and interns take care of the mystery collections. I have never seen so many mystery collections in my entire life. I had racks in here that had little labels that, like, what is this? Or, one was trouble. And so it was just like all these, 50, 60 years worth of things that we uncovered as part of this. So, oh, Kevin, can I run the slides? Or do you have, we also have an advisory board, and a tribal advisory board composed of Chief Wallace, Chief Barnes, Marcus Winchester, Diane Hunter, and Nicole Allagood. We have not really been active with them as much as we wanted to, but part of that is due to the change in processes, which we'll talk about in a little bit. And part of it is we haven't gotten to the scanning and thinking about how to handle the most sensitive of artifacts. So those are the discussions we will have with them. So we were awarded this grant in May 2020. So basically COVID hit, we were awarded the grant. We're like, so Tdar, we took training from them. They're in Arizona. The training we took in July 2020 was the first virtual training they had done. And so it was very helpful and useful. And, I'm glad we could get that done, and they were flexible enough to do it virtual. And it was very personalized for us. It, gave us a general idea of Tdar, how to handle the metadata, some quality control tips. The biggest thing is kind of the third bullet point from the bottom, is the importance of a style guide. And what they call as a style guide is basically so that your data is entered consistently, so it can be searchable and your data elements are validated, and that type of thing. Next slide. So the basic Tdar structure, Tdar has collections, which we'll have a collection for our reports of investigation, and then we'll have another collection for our archaeological reports. And then Tdar has projects. So each project will be an ROI, or in the case of the old archaeological reports, each chapter in some cases is a project, because those are like annual reports that are summaries of all the projects that happened that year. So the archaeological reports and the ROIs are very different, and they have to be structured differently in Tdar. And we actually are going to have sub collections for the ARs. And then Tdar has resources, and then resources, our reports will be a resource. So there's different types. So a report will be a document resource, and we'll have both redacted and non-redacted versions. Artifacts, photos are image resources, and we will store those in several different file types. Artifact 3D images, I believe, are called sensory resources, and they each have associated metadata with each type of resource. One of the most interesting things in Tdar is we can show spatial coverage, and of course temporal coverage, but the spatial coverage is greater than or equal to a mile, so it protects the sensitivity of site locations. The project workflow planned, I'm kind of a project manager at heart, so it felt like the best way to plan this large of a project is that each quarter we would attack a subsection of the ARs or ROIs, and that we would process all of those at once. So, we would do all the scanning, and we would do all the digitization, and we do all the upload. And so then at the end of each quarter, we'd have a really good checkpoint that we would have, 20% of our work done, and we'd see the finished product. That's how we proposed it in our plan, in our application, and then we'd have these deliverables that we could see. So next slide, please. This is in reality, what the project workflow became. As we dug into this process, there were so many connections and so many issues that we had to work through with the old collections that we could not approach this in such a planned, linear, and structured fashion, that we kind of had to do what we could do at the point we could do it with the students we had. So with the workflow, next slide, Kevin. What the workflow became is we concentrated on getting the metadata in. We concentrated on scanning and photographing artifacts, and then we concentrated on digitizing reports. So we kind of grouped our student assistants and even our staff they were kind of assigned to one of these tasks. So I made them different colors. So staff didn't have to know everything. You know, if they were in charge of QCing 3D scanning, that's really all they had to know. And the students that worked on that, that's all they had to know. One of the biggest issues that we kind of knew of, but we didn't know the extent, is kind of in the blue processes there. The second little bar, all of the diagnostic points that had been collected probably up until the last 8 or 10 years had been pulled out from their regular collection boxes, and they had been put in that big cabinet that I pointed out. So each drawer in that cabinet was labeled with a point type. So you had all those points in there that had catalog numbers. So they had site numbers and catalog numbers, but you had no idea what ROI or AR they went to. So we had a really good intern a year ago last summer, and she went through every one of those, and she started tying back the points to the ROIs and the ARs. And of course, to do that, we had to do the very first thing in that blue section, and we had to create a table of sites associated with each AR and ROI, which sounds way simpler than it is. We still haven't worked through all the issues. You know, sometimes the oldest reports didn't really even have, you know, a site summary or a site list. So we had to check several different places. I'd say we have that 90% done. The hard ones are hard to figure out. And that was all done in an Access database. Another tricky part is some sites were reinvestigations. So we had a site number that was in both ROI 12 and ROI 50. And so when the intern had a point from that ROI, she had to actually look at the report to see which one of those ROIs it came from. So we didn't plan for that. We kind of knew that was there, but so next slide, Kevin. So everything that we did was put in. Everything that we did that was going to end up in Tdar was put in an Access database. So this is the table that has the project number, so the AR or the ROI, and then it has the site number. We also assign each site number a site sequence. So one of the things we had to figure out is how do we keep all this data running through all these processes, and we keep track of it all. So every artifact that we've pulled from that cabinet or other cabinets gets we call it a scanning name, and the scanning name is a combination of the AR or ROI and the site sequence number, and then a sequence number of the diagnostic artifact within that site. So it sounds complicated, but once you get going, it works. And this is an example of the Access database that basically mimics Tdar. So Tdar is good and serves its purpose, but it lacks some data validation. And I just didn't want students to be putting stuff into Tdar live. And so they put everything in here, and then as they have questions, they make an issues list. Next slide. So for each process, you know, we kind of walk through how we defined those processes in the application. So digitizing reports, we use our existing printer scanner. They're actually scanned as PDFAs. The oldest reports are paper only, so then we run OCR off of those. And then the OCR version, excuse me, gets a redacted version gets created for public use. So we'd have both a non-redacted and a redacted version. With the older reports, there's also a lot of OCR correction that needs done because, you know, they're typewritten. Artifact 3D scanning. So we use NextEngine and Einstein scanners. We have a large tracking spreadsheet that we track each step because we have multiple students working on that. And then those get ingested into Tdar. Next slide. Kevin talked about Sketchfab. So that's a repository for 3D models, but they will also be ingested into Tdar when the time comes. Oh, thanks. Artifact photography, you know, fairly standard. We are using a software to kind of speed things up. We scan both sides, and there's multiple files that we save as and ingest. And those photographs are the same naming convention as the scans. So everything kind of runs off one scanning name throughout the whole process. Challenges, COVID, oh my gosh. COVID has just wrecked this project. I sent in my first status report and they they came back and said, thank you for your honesty, because some things I didn't even know how to explain very well. You know, you have the typical COVID things, plus we had students, you know, with social distancing, we had to change rooms over and over again. We had to keep students apart. Sharing scanners was an issue. Last year we had isolation and quarantines over and over and over. This year it's more about COVID weariness. You know, we have students that just, they're having a hard time keeping their schedules because they're just burnt out, and it's, you know, just having troubles with that. So much unbudgeted time spent on COVID related issues. You know, it's also been difficult to convene our tribal advisory board. Next slide. Old collections and paperwork, you know, I could talk for a day on all of this, and, you know, I'm sure you all realize that. 75% of what we go through is fairly easy. The other 20% is hard. Some of it's really hard, and we're never gonna figure it out. And so, you know, the bottom bullet point is kind of the story of this slide. Don't let perfect be the enemy of good. So, you know, we have to move things along and, you know, get it good enough on a project like this. Next slide. And this is just another indication of some of the things the students do. Metadata is, you know, that's also one of those things that, you know, a lot of it's easy. Some of it's really, really hard. And when is good enough, good enough. You know, how do you handle obvious errors? What do you fix and what do you leave as the official record? You know, what if the official record's in error? You know, how do you deal with reports that are summaries and you're missing the details? How do you deal with evolution of terms and identification over time? You know, those are things that we are dealing with, and I can't wait to be done with this project and write some articles and give some presentations on all of our lessons learned. Next slide. I'll let Kevin talk about this one and take it to the end here.
Okay, so challenges with 3D scanning. Again, Chris already covered the artifact IDs. So the ROI 31006 sixth, a second artifact from the 6th site of our 31st ROI. And this has been, with all of the different jumbling parts, has been a big challenge with the spreadsheet that she mentioned, but also with hardware and software errors. If anybody's ever used NextEngine scanners, they can be glitchy, put it mildly. And sometimes they had to do rescanning. Sometimes there were errors in the acquisition. Sometimes we couldn't align them. And so we had a really great student team that was very detail oriented and able to come up with ways to both problem solve, but also track in detail so that it's transferring information between shift to shift and person to person and stage to stage was all clearly laid out, and we could all keep track of all of that. Then we got our emergency relief grant. We tried to buy 2 more NextEngine scanners to speed up the process with our distributed workspace. Well, I think NextEngine went out of business, and it took 8 months for us to finally decide that we weren't going to get those scanners and move on. So now we have Einscan SP scanners, and so now we've had to develop 2 different sets of processes for managing that. Then we also had a lovely institutional thing where we were using Box to share files for the project. And over the summer, the university switched from Box to OneDrive, and that migration did not go smoothly, and created some corruptions in some of our data. And again, that the quality control and the wonderful student team that we have had working on this to find errors, troubleshoot, and solve those process problems has been fantastic. So success, we've got about 95% of the ROI projects into Tdar in draft form with most of the metadata in there. And we have most of our resources for the ROI documents. Those are the easier ones that are more recent and more focused projects. For 3D scanning, we've got about 2,000 scans done, with 1,500 of them in various parts of the processing, and over 740 of them uploaded to Sketchfab already. And we've got about 50 to 75% of the reports digitized with OCR and corrected OCR, processed and fully redacted. We have not had a chance to convene our tribal advisory board, but hopefully we'll soon. Don't think we have a demo time, but if you want to, you can go to that. So what's up next? We need to get our advisory board together to discuss how we handle the distribution of sensitive information. And we still have lots of issues to resolve. We just figured out how to manage the multiple different projects that are within the bound version of an AR, and how to match that to the style guide for Tdar. We still have to complete our 3D scanning, about halfway through. Photography, a lot more of that to do, and complete the ingestion for ARs or for ROIs, and then enact the process for the ARs. And then we'll finish with more conference presentations and public outreach about the resources that we have created. And acknowledgements, we have to acknowledge the clear funding. Also our tribal advisory board, those who were willing to work with us on this project. Also the Tdar trainers and our grant administrators here in the Sponsor Projects Administration at Ball State.
Hey, thank you, Kevin and Chris, and those who could not attend but are part of the project as well, including Emily, who I shamefully forgot to include in the original credits there. Unfortunately, we have to keep rolling along here to the business meeting, but if you have questions, my recommendation would be to using the chat function in the WebEx meeting or even on the YouTube live stream. You could post a comment there, or you can directly message the individual person you want to ask the question to, obviously with the direct messages on the WebEx chat. So we're going to keep moving along here to the business meeting. This is going to conclude the live stream for now, because the business meeting will not be streamed on YouTube. So unfortunately, those of you who are watching along on YouTube are members of the public. This will no longer be live stream. So thank you so much for joining us, and that'll do it.
Okay, for the business meeting, I'm going to just go ahead and plow through. If you need to take a break,